"All aboard the bus. We're leaving in 5 minutes," shouted Mr. Thomas. The bus soon took off, and as Jake was looking out of the bus window, Tim tapped him on his shoulders. "Hey, Jake, what did you pack for our camp?" asked Tim. "Nothing much, just clothes and a couple of snacks," said Jake. "And snacks is what I have, too. Check this out," said Tim as he opened his bag to show off the snacks he brought. "We can share if you want," continued Tim. "Wow, thanks a lot, Tim," said Jake. As Jake was still looking into Tim's bag, Jake then asked, "Oh, why did you bring a pair of scissors along?" "Oh, my mom said I have to put this under my pillow at night. She said that at these kinds of isolated campsites, there are many spirits lingering around. This protects us from them," explained Tim. "Oh, really? But I didn't bring any scissors with me," said Jake. "All the best to you, then," joked Tim. "Great, I will have to endure being haunted for the 2 nights that we are here," said Jake. The bus finally arrived. The students got off, and there in front of them was the campsite. With no other groups there, Jake and his classmates' tents were the only ones at the campsite. The day went by, which included pond fishing and the students' first kayaking experience. And finally, after the sun had set, the students got the chance to sit at the campsite for dinner. They chatted, laughed, and had the valuable experience of spending a nice evening together without their parents, which they rarely get as 14-year-olds. After being briefed on the following day's activities, it was late into the night and the students prepared themselves for bed. Jake and Tim shared the same tent, and right before Tim laid down on his sleeping bag's pillow, he placed his pair of scissors underneath it. Reminded of their conversation earlier, Jake began getting nervous, knowing that he didn't have his own pair of scissors as protection. Jake then said to Tim, "If I see anything, I'll borrow your scissors for a while, okay?" "No way, I can share my snacks, but not my scissors. When it comes to that, it's every boy for himself," said Tim. As Tim fell asleep in almost an instant, Jake just couldn't do the same. 11 p.m. turned to midnight, and after more tossing and turning, Jake looked at his watch. It's almost 3 a.m., and Jake was still wide awake. Suddenly, Jake heard someone walking towards his tent. As the tent was only a rooftop cover and a canvas sheet placed on the ground to lie on, Jake could see his surroundings outside of his tent. As Jake was still hearing sounds of someone walking, but unsure where the sound was exactly coming from, he suddenly saw an orange ping-pong ball slowly roll towards his foot. To his confusion and slight horror, he suddenly saw a small boy with pale skin, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, walk towards the ball and bent down to look inside Jake's tent. As the boy looked Jake in the eye, Jake immediately knew that what was staring right at him wasn't a living person. The boy then turned around and called out, "Grandma, he's here," while pointing towards Jake. Those words turned his slight fear into complete fright, knowing that something else was coming towards him. Jake closed his eyes and put his blanket over his head. While covered underneath his blanket, Jake could hear someone else walk over and finally stood near Jake's foot. Then Jake heard the small boy saying, "Him, Grandma. He's the one." Already starting to tremble, Jake then heard the supposed grandma say, "It's okay, my dear. We shall just stand here till—" Jake's trembles turned to silent cries, before eventually Jake screamed out loud, "Ah, help me, help!" as he interrupted the voices he heard earlier. Tim and those from nearby tents, including Mr. Thomas, woke up. Mr. Thomas then came over and asked, "What's wrong, Jake? Are you okay?" Jake uncovered his blanket, opened his eyes, and stopped shouting. Jake looked around and noticed that the boy and his grandma were no longer there. All Jake saw above his head was Mr. Thomas looking worried. "Are you all right?" asked Mr. Thomas. I saw a child. He brought his grandma," stuttered Jake. Seeing how Jake looked pale, Mr. Thomas said, "Okay, guys, the rest of you go back to sleep. Jake, let's go to my tent. I'll give you something to help you sleep." Once they were at Mr. Thomas's tent, Mr. Thomas took out a prayer booklet from his backpack and told Jake, "Put this underneath your pillow. It should help." "You mean, you know that such things would happen? If you knew, why do you bring us here?" asked Jake. "This place is haunted," continued Jake as he lowered his voice and whispered. "It's late, Jake. Take this and we'll talk again tomorrow morning," said Mr. Thomas. After putting the prayer booklet underneath his pillow, Jake's nerves calmed down as he quickly fell asleep after staying up almost all night. A few hours later, after they had finished their breakfast, Jake immediately went over to Mr. Thomas's tent and asked, "Hey, Mr. Thomas, I thought you wanted to tell me more about what happened yesterday." "Oh yeah, almost forgot. Okay, Jake. These kinds of places will attract such things. No matter which campsite I bring you guys to, it's the same. It's dark. We're away from the city lights. They like these sorts of environments. We could only be prepared when coming to such places," said Mr. Thomas. "Great to know they're everywhere. The grandma's voice really creeped me out," said Jake, sounding defeated. "It's gonna be fine. Don't think too much about it. The more you're afraid, the more it can sense you, and the more likely it will come after you," said Mr. Thomas. "We still have one more night here. What if they come after me again tonight?" asked Jake. "Don't think about it, and focus on getting some sleep. If you see the boy again, just tell him not to disturb you. Your braveness will ward off such spirits," explained Mr. Thomas. "All right, I'll try," said Jake. After a long day of fishing and several other team bonding activities, midnight drew near, and everyone else, including Tim, seemed to have fallen asleep. Then, as Jake had his eyes closed and had his blanket partially covering his face, he heard the sound of the ping-pong ball rolling towards his tent again. Jake then told himself, "Oh man, not again. I thought it's going to be fine once I have this protection underneath my pillow," referring to the prayer booklet that Mr. Thomas gave him earlier. "And why can't I fall asleep? Everyone else don't seem to have any problems sleeping," Jake thought to himself. Suddenly, as Jake heard the same sound of the boy running towards his tent again, Jake's heart began racing. Knowing that the boy's grandma would follow suit, Jake immediately called out, "Mr. Thomas! Mr. Thomas!" "Well, what is it this time, Jake?" mumbled Tim as he slowly woke up, sounding annoyed. Once again, Mr. Thomas woke up and rushed over to Jake's tent. Knowing that Jake was disturbed again even after being given the prayer booklet, Mr. Thomas knew that there was something more to it. "Hey, Jake, did you remember taking anything from the places we went earlier?" asked Mr. Thomas. "I don't think so. Oh, wait. There's this piece of cool white stone that I found yesterday after we were done kayaking," said Jake as he took it out of his backpack. After taking a closer look at the piece of white stone, Mr. Thomas said, "Jake, I don't think that is a white stone. That looks more like a piece of broken skull. We must return it back to where you found it, tonight. Mr. Thomas asked the help of another teacher to watch the rest of the students while he went back to the kayaks lake with Jake. As Mr. Thomas and Jake walked to the end of the campsite heading towards the lake, standing before them was a thick layer of trees that they would have to pass. Okay, Jake, if you see or hear anything along the way, don't panic and keep walking. It's going to be fine, all right? Said Mr. Thomas. Okay, Mr. Thomas, replied Jake, sounding nervous. As they hurriedly walked through the trees, both Mr. Thomas and Jake heard voices a couple of times that said, "Hey, give it back." Almost there, Jake, said Mr. Thomas as they finally saw an opening through the trees. Out of the trees, they finally are out and facing the open lake. Okay, Jake, we're finally here. Where did you pick it up from? Asked Mr. Thomas. Still slightly panting from both tiredness of walking quickly through the trees and also the fear that ran through him, Jake breathed and said, "If I remember correctly, it was from there," while pointing at the other side of the pond. The two of them carefully walked over, as there weren't any lights there other than their dimly lit torchlights. As Jake was carefully placing the piece of broken skull back in its original spot, Mr. Thomas suddenly noticed a small tombstone right behind Jake, almost submerged in dried leaves that you could barely notice it. Mr. Thomas told Jake to shine his torchlight on it, while Mr. Thomas walked over and swept aside the thick layer of dried leaves. Gradually, the writing on the tombstone became readable. It said, "Here lies Grandma Addie and her favorite grandson, Sam, whom we tragically lost through a car accident right at this very spot. We truly miss the both of you." Hearing a distant whisper from across the pond, Mr. Thomas and Jake turned their heads. Stood there still, Mr. Thomas and Jake saw a grandma and her grandson, who gave a smile before gradually fading into the night. Although completely terrified, Mr. Thomas and Jake both knew why the spirits came after Jake for 2 nights in a row. All they ever wanted was for Jake to give back what was theirs. After regaining his composure, Mr. Thomas said, "Okay, let's go, Jake. It's finally done," as he guided Jake, who was still slightly frozen in fear, back to their campsite. The next day arrived, and students and teachers were all packed to leave for the site. As Mr. Thomas and Jake took one last look at the campsite, they knew it was a camping trip that they will never forget.